Welcome, everyone. As Ian said, my name is Claire O'Connell. I'm a journalist and I write for the Irish Times. And it's my pleasure to introduce Maryn McKenna this evening. She probably needs very little introduction to most of you, as you'll be familiar with her work. But just to backtrack a little bit, she explained to me before that she got into health reporting initially investigating, as really an investigative journalist, looking at things like cancer clusters and Gulf War syndrome. And that led to her moving to Atlanta and working with the Centres for Disease Control, where she spent 10 years in the Epidemic Intelligence Unit, which sounds very James Bond to me. And she basically went with them watching how they were gathering information on epidemics and the emergence of disease. And that led to her writing a book about the experiences called Beating Back the Devil. More recently, she wrote another book, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, and you can see it over here, and it's called SUPERBUG. And this time it was about the rise and rise of what we call MRSA, but maybe on the other side of the pond they call it MRSA, so there's a bit of a difference there. Now, it's probably everybody in this room has heard of MRSA. It's kind of the poster bug for antibiotic resistance. But I think what Maryn has brought to the coverage of MRSA or MRSA is really not just the facts and figures and trends, and sometimes those trends you have to really zoom out to see them. But I think she also brought very much a personal, kind of a human perspective, driving the story home with the accounts of medics who are trying to grapple with this problem in the clinic, and also the impact of antibiotic resistance on the people who are literally living and dying with this problem. Today, Maryn writes for Wired. She's a blogger at Wired, and she writes for Scientific American. And I think she really takes the blinkers off the issues of disease emergence and sometimes re-emergence. And what I like about her work is that she's really not afraid to ask the hard questions and then go digging for the real answers. In recent weeks, I just had a kind of a flick back through her Wired blog there, even today, just to see what, just to remind myself what she'd been writing about recently. And she's written about all manner of nasties. I have here drug-resistant gonorrhea, the resurgence of whooping cough, where once it had been reasonably under control. And she even drew a painful line between the antibiotic use in chickens and difficult to treat urinary tract infections. So nothing is off limits, I think. So this evening, I think her focus is mostly going to be on cities as part of the Hack the City exhibition that's ongoing here, and really how cities can be, I suppose, breeding grounds for these kinds of organisms as well as ourselves. And I think she's also going to be talking about the spread of resistance to a class of antibiotics called, I can never pronounce this, Carbapenems, is that right? Okay, you can pronounce it. That's the main thing. And that's one of the last resort drugs in our weaponry against some bacteria. So, without further delay, I'll introduce you to Maryn McKenna.
Am I on? I'm on. Thank you. I'm just going to make sure I have some water on the podium. I am so thrilled to be here. I'm incredibly flattered to be asked to speak. I forgot to take my password off. There we go. Okay, now I have my notes. I know about the Science Gallery. This is my first visit to Dublin since I was about 4 years old. And so I know about the Science Gallery from online and through social media. And it's the most fantastic venue now that I see it. I am so impressed at how sleek it is and how modern it is, but also how engaged with the city it seems to be. When I was in college, university, I worked at the American Museum of Natural History, where I was a student assistant to the curator of sedimentology. And the American Museum of Natural History, which was on the Mall in Washington, at that time had probably not updated its collection since the 1950s. It was a classic, stodgy science museum with mannequins of Neanderthals wearing fake fur. On their heads, I think. So to be in a science museum that's not a venue that really reaches out to the place where it is and engages it, particularly in this Hack the City celebration, is really fantastic and so energizing. And I feel especially privileged to talk during this Hack the City festival because I am myself a huge fan of cities. I was born, history. I was born in New York City. I grew up in London. I spend a fair amount of time in Paris. I've lived as a journalist in Washington, Boston, Chicago, and Houston, and I've reported for significant periods of time from Hong Kong, Bangkok, Hanoi, and New Delhi. So cities are kind of interesting to me. And because I'm somebody who glories in the misbehavior of disease organisms, I'm also really interested in the kind of environments and opportunities that cities offer to disease organisms too. So that's what I'm going to talk about a bit. It's a huge subject, and I'm just going to give you a tiny glimpse, I think, about the interplay between cities and diseases. So, to start, cast your minds back to fourth form or so history of the world, to Mesopotamia. We think of the founding of cities, I think, and we think of them as a good thing because they're the thing that jumpstarts civilization. Mankind starts out as hunter-gatherers or nomadic herders, and then the early farmers in Mesopotamia take advantage of periodic flooding and extraordinary fertility, and they start producing more food than a hunter-gatherer society needs. And that allows people to start coalescing into settlements. And really, for the first time, people are living in dense populations, which had not previously happened in human history. And what we get in response to density and sort of as an accommodation to density is innovation, is architecture, fabrication, the differentiation of trades, commerce, governance, and politics. And for the first time, people have enough leisure, and there's the beginnings of income, so art starts to arise. But as much as cities offer opportunities like that to their new populations, they offer opportunities to disease organisms as well, because since people have never before lived in dense concentrations, that means that any disease that wandered into the small group that they were living in had only a couple of evolutionary pathways to follow. It could kill its victims very quickly and burn itself out. Or, if it took a slightly slower course, people would suffer it and become immune to it. Or the disease and the humans would reach a sort of uneasy accommodation in which the disease had not burned out but was persisting in a less virulent form. But when cities start to coalesce, people come into them from wider areas, and then trade starts to develop between settlements, so the networks become wider yet. So disease organisms that have become sort of muted in virulence from living in particular populations now have new potential victims, new people to attack, and virulence resurges, comes back. Plus, if you think about it, a settlement doesn't have to be very big before you have to start worrying about guaranteeing its supply of food and also its supply of fresh water. So once you bring concentrations of animals into a city, you have to worry about disease organisms moving from animals, whether they're being raised or just being held for slaughter, from animals to humans and through the human networks in the city. Similarly, once you start piling up food that you've harvested, you are instantly providing a perfect ground for rodents to survive in. And once you bring water into a city, especially surface water, if you think of the aqueducts of ancient Rome or southwestern Gaul, you bring waterborne parasites with it. And when you convert flowing water to standing water, you make it prime breeding ground for mosquitoes. So, in addition to all of those, in addition to the problem of providing new environments for disease organisms and new victims for disease organisms, there's a further problem. And the writer, Stephen B. Johnson, who's a professor at New York University, in his book, The Ghost Map, which is fantastic. It's a popular history of cholera. I recommend it. He poses the problem this way. What are we going to do with all this shit? Which is to say that one of the biggest difficulties for cities from ancient times and even up to the modern day is that they instantly have to deal with a certain concentration of people with their concentration of waste. And that means both garbage and everyday waste, food waste, and it also means human waste, which are packed with bacteria that can contaminate surfaces and contaminate water sources. So, people coalescing, animals coming in, water changing its behavior, having to deal with waste. As cities grow, the opportunities that cities offer to disease organisms grow too. And if you can call what happened before settlements the pre-municipal era, in the pre-municipal era, we only had local outbreaks because local was really all there was. But as cities become larger and trade networks spread, suddenly local outbreaks become dramatic epidemics. And you can see that really clearly through ancient history. Cities start in the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia, about 1100 BC or before the Common Era. Rome gets founded in about 750, and in Asia, the Han dynasty, about 250 BCE, starts to unify China, ruling from a capital in Western China. But running in parallel with all those achievements, 430 BC or BCE, the plague of Athens kills about a third of the city's population. 165 AD, or of the Common Era, soldiers returning to Rome bring what was probably smallpox and start the Antonine Plague and kill about a third of the city's population, including 2 emperors in succession. The Han dynasty, which has been going for about 500 years, gets dismantled by a plague in about 200 CE. And in 540, the plague of Justinian, which may have been bubonic plague, but people are still not really sure, starts in Constantinople, spreads through the known world, kills about a third of the population of the Eastern Mediterranean. So cities over generations get better at being cities as they're around more, as they get more dense and complex, as people get used to the idea of organizing cities. But the disease problem doesn't get much better. The big epidemics, such as the ones I just mentioned, burn themselves out, but new ones take their place. In 1300, we get bubonic plague returning, the one that's so dramatic that that's the point at which it becomes known as the Black Death, 1348. And then plague comes back, not just in the 1300s, but the 1400s, the 1500s, the 1600s. There's not just Yersinia pestis, the plague, but also yellow fever and typhus and tuberculosis, and the list goes on. And there's a new book that came out earlier this year by an independent scholar in the UK named Peter Smith. It's called City, a guidebook for the urban age. I really recommend it. Peter makes the point that it's always been bad for us to live in cities. That until the 20th century, more people died in cities than were born in them. Cities were not self-sustaining. The only reason that cities kept going is because there was a constant importation of people in from surrounding areas as a result of their economic opportunities. And to be clear, the reason why cities are not self-sustaining up until the modern era is overwhelmingly as a result of infectious disease. I think it's hard for us all to remember, it's certainly hard for me to remember as I look back, that the things that kill us now in the 21st century, the chronic lifestyle diseases, cancer, heart disease, kidney failure, those are not the things that used to kill people. People didn't used to live long enough to develop chronic lifestyle diseases, and they didn't live long enough because they died of infectious disease. Even if you were injured on a battlefield because your oxen ran over you when you were plowing, or because you fell into the works of one of the factories of the industrial era, it was usually secondary infection, not the injury itself, that killed you. So cities as becoming increasingly more complex, diseases becoming increasingly complex, and though I shouldn't anthropomorphize them, inventive. The only thing that's positive in that history is that for every disease assault, cities sort of self-correct in response. And the best example, I think, of this, at least the best known example, is one that, as scary disease girl ghoul that I am, I particularly kind of glory in, which is the London cholera outbreak of 1854, which is an outbreak that gives rise to the modern science of epidemiology. So cholera an ancient disease, probably originates in South Asia, and doesn't appear in the West until the 1800s. England has its first case in 1831. And then in the summer of 1854, there is a ferocious outbreak in London, centered in the neighborhood of Soho. More than 600 people die. There's a local physician who's developing what we now think of as shoe leather detective epidemiology, John Snow, and a local minister, Henry Whitehead. And thanks to them, the source of that outbreak is traced to one particular pump on Broad Street in Soho, which has become contaminated with sewage from a cesspit in a house nearby. At the time, people are still not really accepting the germ theory of disease. Pasteur's experiments are about 5 years in the future. Koch's postulates won't be published until the 1890s. This is 1854. But Snow is convinced that cholera is waterborne and that it's being spread through the drinking water in this neighborhood. And he draws a map, a very famous map that overlays both house by house where the cholera victims are and how many victims, and also the municipal pumps that the victims use and what routes they take to go to all those different pumps. And that map establishes very clearly that one particular pump, the Broad Street pump, is causing this outbreak in Soho. He convinces a local neighborhood committee, the vestry committee, that this is the source, and based on his pleadings and on his map, they take the handle off the pump so it can't be used, and the outbreak shuts down. What they do is actually very unpopular. The Board of Health actually tells them that they have made a mistake, that cholera is not being spread by water, it's being spread by miasmas, by bad air. And the medical journal, The Lancet, actually publishes an editorial denouncing Snow for this and saying that he's got it completely wrong. I don't think out of all their archives they've put that one online. Maybe they should. But it turns out, of course, that Snow and Whitehead are right, that cholera is in fact being spread by the drinking water system, this thing that is still relatively new, that has brought piped fresh water into the city, not just to pumps, but even to every individual house, a major municipal achievement that contains within it, accidentally, the seeds of its users' potential destruction. That act of drawing the map and convincing people where the outbreak source is and taking the handle off the pump have a bunch of effects that kind of ripple through time. The most immediate is that just 4 years later, in 1858, London builds its first major municipal sewage system that is careful to take its drinking water. It's both an inflow and an outflow system, and they engineer it so there will never again be the possibility of sewage coming into the drinking water, the potable water system. And they do it well. It takes them a little while. By 1858, when London is doing this, New York has been working on its sewers since 1849. Paris, as part of its reorganization that built all the grand boulevards since the 1830s. But London does it right, because after 1858, when the sewage system is rebuilt, they never have an attack of cholera again. But there's something else that I think is an effect of what Snow and Whitehead do, and that is that they prove, maybe for the first time, that cities can exert some control over disease outbreaks. That what makes a disease preventable is, or what allows a disease to be prevented, is not just the individual actions of the citizens, of what they eat or drink or where they go or whether they go out after dark or what parts of the city they hang out in, but it's actually municipal action that keeps the disease from happening, group action. And Jane Jacobs, the North American author who has so much to say about modern urbanism, in her book, The Death and Life of the Great American City, she calls cities after that point as seeing themselves as great disease conquerors, which is a new thing. Something else happens, of course, that makes it much easier to conquer diseases, which is that almost exactly 70 years after They start the building of London's sewer system. A bacteriologist working in London at St. Mary's Hospital named Alexander Fleming makes what we these days would probably consider a lab error, which is that he leaves his window open because it's summer in London and it's hot, and something blows in across his culture plates. And then he goes away for a couple of weeks, and when he comes back and needs to reuse the culture plates, because it's 1858, they don't have plastics yet, they have a limited amount of glass, he goes to clean the plates off. He's working on staph, Staphylococcus, and staph on a culture plate grows in such an even layer that it's called a lawn. But when he picks up one of the plates, it's not solid with staph, it's polka dot. The polka dots are dead zones. And in the center of every dead zone is a speck of mold that blew in the window. The mold is Penicillium. It gives rise to the first antibiotic, penicillin. So even though that's 1928, penicillin takes a while to make it to market. The sulfa drugs actually beat it there in the 1930s, but penicillin gets deployed first on the battlefields of World War II in the early 1940s, and then it's released to the general public, at least in the United States, in about 1944, and the world completely changes. The antibiotic era that we so trust begins. Because of Snow and Whitehead, people were willing to see diseases as preventable by joint action. But antibiotics actually make diseases curable. And just to take staph as an example, which Fleming was working on, before penicillin, serious staph infections of the bloodstream, kill 9 out of 10 victims. After penicillin is introduced, people with staph bacteremia recover in 48 hours. It seems like a miracle. When people refer to the antibiotic miracle, they're not being hyperbolic. Fleming and his collaborators, the people who actually made it possible for penicillin to become a drug, to be synthesized in the laboratory, Ernst Chain and Howard Florey, get the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1945. And Fleming, unusually in his acceptance speech, doesn't just glory in what they've done. Instead, he uses the speech to deliver a warning. And what he says is that these precious compounds that they've managed to identify and isolate and synthesize are going to be abused, and that antibiotic resistance is going to result. And the antibiotic era is still so new, and everyone is so much glorying in it that no one listens to what he has to say. It's really bizarre now to go back and read that speech. But he's absolutely right. Because in 1947, an epidemic of penicillin-resistant staph begins to spread across the world, starting in Australia. It shows up in women and babies, women who have given birth in hospitals, have been there for a couple of days with their newborns, and then go home, and then come back to the hospital within 1 to 2 weeks, both of them grievously ill. No one knows what to do. The magical gift of penicillin has been lost so quickly. And this penicillin-resistant staph moves around the world. By 1951, it's on the western coast of the United States. By 1953, it's spread across the US, and the American Medical Association convenes a summit meeting, a national summit, in Cleveland, because Case Western University there has a fantastic staph research unit. And when you read the accounts, the transcripts of that meeting, it's clear that they're completely panicked. They have no idea what they've done to make the antibiotic miracle go away so quickly. And among the people listening to this are not just other healthcare institutions, not just the health agencies of the US federal government, but also pharmaceutical manufacturers. And one of the responses to that summit meeting in 1953 is that in 1960, Beecham Laboratories in the UK comes out with a new drug, the first semi-synthetic penicillin, the first of the now vast category of beta-lactam antibiotics. It's called methicillin. They advertise it on the back page of the British Medical Journal, and their ad says, "Proof against all staphylococci, resistance unlikely to develop." And they're right on the effect. It does kill staph. It kills penicillin-resistant staph really well. They're a little off on the timing. The first case of methicillin-resistant staph, MRSA, surfaces in a hospital outside London 11 months later. And now we have a worldwide epidemic. I'm not even sure what the numbers are at this point, but just in the United States, MRSA, as we call it, kills about 19,000 people a year and sends at least 7 million, probably more, to doctors' offices or emergency rooms. And what the introduction of methicillin and the rise of methicillin-resistant staph does is to start the antibiotic arms race. Perhaps that really even starts with penicillin. We have an organism, we introduce a compound, the organism learns to defend itself against the compound, we come out with another drug. And we've been playing this game of leapfrog now since the 1960s. And, of course, the organisms are winning because they have a new generation every 20 minutes. And it takes us 10 years to get a new drug to market. When I talk, as I often do, in my reporting to people who work in academic medical centers, I hear from them all the time. I cannot think of anyone I have spoken to at an academic medical center who has not said this. Someone will say, I see patients for whom we might as well be in the pre-antibiotic era, for whom no drugs work. The antibiotic era is less than 100 years old. If you start counting from 1928, we're close to 100 years. If you start counting from 1930 or 1940, we haven't even had that long, and already we have used up most of the drugs. For the most resistant infections, there are 1 or 2 drugs that still work, and most of them work not because they're great drugs or because they're new drugs, but because they're old and toxic and less effective drugs that were left on the shelf while we used the better drugs and used them up. And about this point, you were wondering what this has to do with cities, since I started talking about cities. So part of the connection, is just that we are now a planet of cities. More than 50% of the human race lives in cities now. That's where disease transmission happens. But it also turns out that just as John Snow discovered in Soho with cholera, there are hidden networks of distribution, connections between cities that permit now specifically antibiotic-resistant bugs to spread. If we identify those networks and trace them, they may also allow us to exert some control over new forms of antibiotic resistance. I think that's an open question. So, quick history lesson. I know there are medical faculty in the audience. You can just take a nap for the next 90 seconds while I describe gram-positives and gram-negatives. Thank you. Okay, the most resistant organisms are called the gram-negatives, dating back to a Danish microbiologist named Gram, developed the stains that allow us to see bacteria under a microscope. Bacteria are gram-negative or gram-positive because of the way they take up the stain, but what the way they take up the stain really shows is what their cell wall or cell membrane is like. Is it 1 layer, gram-positive, or 2 layers, gram-negative? The reason why that's important for the next things I'm going to say is because most antibiotics do something in relation to the cell wall to kill a bacterium, to break it open, to keep it from fusing when new bacteria are made, or to get inside the wall and do things inside the bacterium. If you have a double-layered cell wall, all of that is much more difficult. It means it's more difficult to make a drug. And for most resistant gram-negatives, as a result, there are very few drugs that work, even fewer than there are for MRSA and the other gram-positives. There might be 5 or 6 new drugs for MRSA in the drug development pipeline around the world. For gram-negatives, there might be 1. Actually, depending on how far out you go looking down the pipeline, there might be 20 for gram-positives, all of them in very early stages. For gram-negatives, almost nothing. So people have been watching the development of resistance in gram-negatives now for more than 20 years. The most recent concern dates back to 1996. The US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, ran, it's closed now, a project where they took just a random selection of bacterial samples, isolates, from hospitals around the US to watch for the development of resistance. And in 1996, they found a single isolate from a hospital in North Carolina that was a gram-negative, Klebsiella pneumoniae, and it was resistant to the last category, the last family of drugs that worked reliably against the gram-negatives, called the Carbapenems. So the trick, you will all know this, in tracking antibiotic resistance is knowing when to ring the warning bell, right? Maybe something is just a one-time thing. Maybe it's not going to persist. Maybe a mutation looks bad, but it's just going to die out. After 1996, that resistance to carbapenems seems to disappear, and people exhale. They think perhaps that was just random. And we dodged the bullet. We got lucky. Until 2000. They didn't actually get to exhale for very long. Because in 2000, doctors in a hospital in Lower Manhattan in New York City report that they have an outbreak, not a single case, but multiple cases of carbapenem-resistant Klebsiella pneumoniae in their intensive care units, in multiple intensive care units in their hospital. And it responds to only 2 drugs, neither of them particularly good ones. 2 years later, a hospital in Brooklyn, which is 8 miles away across a river, says the same thing, an outbreak of carbapenem-resistant Klebsiella, KPC or CRKP, depending on which acronym you prefer. 2005, 3 years after that, the resistant organism shows up in a hospital in Harlem, Upper Manhattan, 6 miles from the first hospital. 2 years later, comes down in a hospital right next to Central Park, Mount Sinai School of Medicine. So all of those hospitals are academic medical centers. New York University, State University of New York downstate, Harlem Hospital, Mount Sinai School of Medicine. They all have excellent infection control problems, and yet they all have this incredibly resistant strain spreading in their intensive care units, multiple intensive care units. It turns out that there's something that stitches together all the hospitals, and that's both the healthcare workers and the patients. Because when patients are sick enough to be in an intensive care unit, if they don't die, they move from the intensive care unit to a step-down unit, to a medical ward. Then they might go to a rehab hospital. If they're elderly, which is likely for someone in an ICU, they might go back to a nursing home or to another long-term care facility. And then they have another outbreak, another acute episode, and they go back to a hospital again. Maybe not the same hospital they went to the first time. What brings CRKP from hospital to hospital in New York City is the movement of its patients through the city in a sort of hidden network, as hidden as the drinking water pipes that John Snow saw in 1854. And to a certain degree, it's the movement of healthcare personnel as well, who may have jobs in more than one place, or a primary job somewhere and be attending somewhere else as a faculty member, or a physician's assistant who's working in a couple of different healthcare systems. The thing is, that network isn't confined to New York City. After about 2005, it becomes clear that CRKP is going wherever New Yorkers go, which in the winter is places that is warm and sunny. So it shows up in Florida, and then it shows up in Sun City, Arizona, and then it shows up in another place where a lot of New Yorkers go because New York is one of the centers of the Jewish diaspora around the world. It shows up in Israel. And by 2007, there have been 1,400 CRKP cases in intensive care units in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. From New York, one New York patient is hospitalized in Paris. CRKP shows up in Paris. From Israel, it spreads into hospitals in Colombia and Brazil, in South America, and to Scotland, and to Greece, and then to England, and then to Northern Ireland. And it shows up here in the Irish Republic in 2009. And in 2011, you have your first hospital-to-hospital outbreak as well. So I think it would be reasonable to say, so what? It's only within hospitals. It's only people who are already extremely sick, and given what we know about the state of hospitals today and the economic crisis, maybe this is the risk that you take. So let me tell you instead about another spread, another antibiotic-resistant organism spreading not just through hospitals, but through the wider world, it really kind of brings us back to the story of Jon Snow. It starts like this. In 2007, there's a man, he's 59 years old. He was born in India, but he's been living for years in Sweden. And he goes home, as he does every year, to visit his family. And while he's there, he's been chronically ill for quite a while. He has diabetes, he has heart disease, he has diabetic foot ulcers. He goes into the hospital in New Delhi. And he's there for a while, and he has surgery, and then he gets better, and he goes home to Sweden. And then he's hospitalized again. And while he's there, his Swedish doctors find something quite odd in the tests that they're running periodically on him because he's in the ICU. They find a strain of Klebsiella that's resistant to almost everything, even to the last resort drugs that the doctors in New York City have been using. When you look at the American-type culture collections table of the tests they eventually run on this, it's R's all the way down for resistant. It's not the same genetic mechanism as what caused CRKP or KPC. The resistance comes from a different source, from a gene that's never been identified before that produces an enzyme that defeats the action of carbapenem antibiotics. They name it after its presumed place of origin, New Delhi. They call it New Delhi metallo-beta-lactamase for the particular action, or, as most people have come to know it, NDM1. So the Swedish group, with help from the University of Cardiff, published that single case in 2008. By 2009, the UK's Health Protection Agency announces that it's identified 22 cases in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And in 2010, the US CDC starts to find cases in the US as well. Initially 3, there have now been 13. What almost all those cases have in common is some tie to South Asia, though not all of them. In some cases, it's people who've gone for elective surgery. In some cases, it's people who were traveling and were injured and needed emergency treatment. In some cases, it's people who've just gone home. What's unusual about NDM from the start is that it's not only present in Klebsiella. Once the UK and the US start analyzing the cases they've had, they see that it's not just in that bacterium that tends to attack people in intensive care units. It's also in bacteria that are just commonly existing in people's intestines without causing illness, including E. coli, one of the most common bacteria on the planet, present in the guts of every warm-blooded thing, and in some cold-blooded things like fish and reptiles as well. And the researchers who first identify NDM1, particularly the folks in Cardiff, instantly understand that things that are in the gut aren't going to stay in the gut, that they're going to exit. And they undertake a couple of analyses in multiple healthcare sites in India and Pakistan and in the UK as well, and they start to identify people who are carrying this piece of DNA without knowing it. They've picked it up somewhere in the environment. They're analyzing people not just in hospital wards, but visiting community health centers. And then they start to look as well at surface water, pools, puddles, and also drinking water taps in New Delhi, and they start to find it there. So this is New Delhi, the capital of one of the most populous nations on the planet, and a country where, because of crowding and very rapid economic development, only about half of the population still has access to municipal sanitation. So what they see, and I'm sure you can, is that this is being picked up without knowing it and being carried without any blame attached to it through the random bad microbiological luck, not just by people who are tied together in healthcare networks, but by casual contact. Families, random travelers, drinking a glass of water in a particular part of the world. And it moves around the world. By the end of last year, NDM1 was in 15 countries. It's here in Ireland. That was announced in February. A 4-month-old child who was born in India, but whose family moved here very shortly thereafter. Last week, even for my ghoulish self, this kind of sets my hair on end. NDM1 was identified in a strain of Vibrio cholerae, which is the bacterial cause of cholera, Jon Snow's old nemesis, one of the most common waterborne bacteria in the world. So, now that I've thoroughly depressed you, what can we say, what can we ask about this interaction between disease organisms and cities that has found a completely new way to leapfrog past our defenses? this is the point at which I get to say that I have no easy answers, which maybe is a little weaselly of me, but I'm going to do it anyway. Because we know evolutionarily, bacteria will always find a way. There are more of them. They reproduce very fast. They have time and the relentless persistence of evolution and natural selection on their sides. But I do think that there are things we can do. I think there are glimmers of hope, which is why it's so fantastic to talk about this in the context of a project called Hack the City. Because I think it's hacking that's going to save us. Just as John Snow's map in 1854 pushed the available tools of his day beyond their common uses into ways they had never been used before. People had certainly drawn maps of outbreaks before, but never in a way that gave enough information for action to be taken in a concerted manner, never in a way that attempted to persuade. I have to believe that there are things in our technologies now that are going to help us counter this threat as well, to allow us to identify things faster, to do surveillance better, to engage crowdsourcing in a way that has never been used in epidemiology before. Cities from their earliest beginnings have been engines of innovation, and despite their demonstrable problems, I have to believe, as somebody who loves cities, that their density of opportunity, which means a density of creativity, is going to help us find the way. Thank you.
Thanks, Maryn. That was a really engaging and some points downright scary talk. Thanks, Maryn. I think we have time to do a few questions. What I might do, I might do a quick chat with you up on stage first, if that's okay, and then we can open the floor for questions. So, do you want to take a seat?
Am I staying on this? Okay.
So I feel a bit Michael Parkinson here. It's great. So I suppose, Maryn, maybe if I can start by asking you a little bit about you. I mean, I'm always interested in people's backgrounds. You obviously have a very good view of the science now of infectious diseases. Did you train as a scientist, or how did you get into the field?
I have an undergraduate degree in 16th century theater and 20th century poetry.
Okay. So there's a bit of a jump.
Somehow that always gets a laugh. I never quite understood why.
So how did you go from there to infectious diseases?
Through what at the time seemed completely random, but of course it makes stepwise sense when I look back. I do in fact have, I am a Shakespeare nerd. I'm not afraid to admit it. That's what I did as an undergraduate. But as a graduate student, I have a master's in journalism. I studied a bunch of different things, but chiefly what I studied was to be an investigative reporter, which in my case meant not lurking in darkened garages and besieging government officials, but rather the kind of investigative work that means digging through a lot of documents. And so my first job as a newspaper reporter was doing investigative work in finance. And on the basis of that, the way, at least it used to be, before newspapers collapsed in the United States, the way you used to build a career was to move from paper to paper, from a small paper to a slightly bigger one to a much bigger one, and eventually you clawed your way all the way up the ladder. So I got offered for my second job the chance to be an investigative reporter in a place that was doing what was essentially sort of its own shoe leather epidemiology. They were trying to figure out what was causing cancer clusters in a town in southwest Ohio, because what was right next to that town was one of the plants that had built nuclear weapons in the Cold War. And all of the residents believed that their cancers were as a result of this weapons plant nearby, which had been run in a completely filthy manner. Waste had gone up the stacks and into the groundwater, and it was a mess. So from that sort of taught me about public health, which was not something that I had ever expected to learn of. And my next investigation in my next job turned out to be identifying the first cases of what we now know as Gulf War syndrome, in the illnesses of a few reservists who had come back from Gulf War I and gone to work back to their regular jobs and lives in western Massachusetts. The fact that they were reservists is important because it meant they weren't still in the military system. So they could talk to people about what they were experiencing. And in fact, they were having a lot of frustration about why they were ill in a very strange manner. But they weren't within the military medical system, which would have made it impossible for them to talk. as a result of those, I ended up, as you said, tagging around behind the CDC's disease detectives, trying to talk my way into their investigations.
Yeah, this intrigues me now. You're literally on the front line with these men and women, I presume, trying to figure out where diseases were coming from and where the next one was going to emerge. I mean, you must have gone around the world and seen all sorts of things. Did you have any standout moments from that decade of being on the front line, literally?
So I was very fortunate to start covering the CDC as a journalist before the attack on the World Trade Center in 2001. The reason why that was fortunate is because after 2001, our government really cranked down and made access much more difficult. And at that point, I'd already been covering the CDC for a few years. When the anthrax letter attacks, which followed the Twin Towers attacks, started in October 2001, I was embedded with one of the CDC teams in Washington, D.C., actually on Capitol Hill, which was I think I am the only reporter that was allowed to do that. That's what I've been told, at any rate. People often ask me, does it unnerve you, even being scary disease girl and loving scary organisms? Does it bother you what you're going in, what you were going out after, since you were accompanying these disease detectives? And the answer is no, because I trusted them. I mean, I was there to report on them. I don't think I trusted them blindly, but those people are pretty intrepid. If they put on gloves, I put on gloves. Okay. If they said it was time to wear a respirator, I wore a respirator. And if I ever heard any of them say to me, "Are you really sure you want to eat that?" I generally listened.
Okay, good advice. What about overseas? I mean, outside of the US, did you look at the emergence of diseases there?
Yeah, so my first book, Beating Back the Devil, is an account of, it's both a history and a narrative of this group of disease detectives, the CDC's Epidemic Intelligence Service. And to do it, I embedded with them for a year, though people didn't really use that phrase at the time. And so for a year, I followed someone from this group of 90 brand new disease detectives to their biggest outbreaks. So I was in a big MRSA outbreak in Los Angeles. I was in a big foodborne disease outbreak in Philadelphia. And we got about halfway through the year, which follows the academic year, and I remember I had just agreed to write a book about it, and I remember my book editor saying, are you sure that this is going to be a good year? Is anything big going to happen? Because at this point, it's the middle of the winter and people are throwing up on cruise ships, and it looks like that's the most exciting thing that's going to happen all year. It doesn't make much of a book. And I said, no, yes, something always happens to these people. Please trust me. And what happened was SARS.
Right, okay.
In February, the end of February 2003, a doctor from a village in southeastern China leaves his village and goes to a family wedding in Hong Kong. And in one evening in the Metropole Hotel in Hong Kong, he crosses paths with 12 other people, passes this new virus to all of them, and within about 72 hours, SARS went around the world. And in 4 months before the outbreak ended, it infected about 8,000 known people and killed almost 800. It was really the first outbreak of the jet age.
Yeah, no, and it's one I think if anybody was around at the time and keeping an eye on it, I think it's one that stands out for everyone. I mean, obviously you've covered a lot of other types of disease as well. I mean, something like SARS came very quickly and was, we have to say, contained pretty well as well. What about MRSA or MRSA? I mean, there's a completely different story. This thing has been welling up for a long time.
The interesting thing about MRSA is, I have a confession here. Like everyone else, not only am I interested in scary diseases, but I am tempted to be most interested in the scariest. I have a stuffed plushie Ebola on my desk at home. It's true. And a little biohazard lunchbox. For some reason that maybe goes back to our, I don't know, maybe to our storytelling history as a species, to our sitting together around fires, listening to people our oldest ancestors tell stories of the big bad animal they killed that day. We have a unique fascination with the really ugly and apocalyptic. And so things like stories of Ebola and stories of SARS and mystery bug in Dublin water.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you all for welcoming me with an outbreak. It was really kind. You didn't have to go that far. These are the things that attract us, and yet the reality is much more damage is done by things that don't swoop, but really more sort of seep. And MRSA is one of those. When I started looking at the history of MRSA, which I got introduced to, as I said, because I was on an MRSA outbreak investigation with the CDC's EIS, I started really to feel some guilt over my professional life to that point, because I felt like I'd been telling people for years, like something out of an old sci-fi movie, look up at the skies, the aliens are coming. Or, look up at the mountain is about to fall on us. And all the time I was telling people to look up, it was like a flood was rising around our feet. And I had never noticed, because I was telling them to look for the rare. I was telling them to look for the zebra, not the horse. And we journalists, I think, or at least me as a journalist, we do a disservice to people, I think, when we fail to remind them that it's the things that are really much more common, like MRSA, like influenza, that probably are the biggest disease threats to their health. Yeah. And not, to this day, there's never been a case of Ebola in the United States. There have been at least 4 importations of Lassa, another viral hemorrhagic fever. They've never spread to anyone other than the index case. So our fascination with the worst apocalyptic stuff is probably out of scale to the actual risk that it poses.
Sure. The more well, I don't want to say MRSA is every day, but compared to something like SARS, it is every day. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of antibiotic resistance, I think you've compared it previously in a very general way to climate change almost, that there was information there, but maybe people didn't pay enough attention to it, or for some reason it just never got dealt with, and now it's this massive, massive problem. How are we going to fix this? Tough question.
I do think climate change is a good example, though I have to say, once I actually said that, I think in an interview or in a blog post when I was talking about MRSA, and someone said to me, you really shouldn't say that, because this is what he said, those of us who don't believe in climate change are going to lose us there.
Fair enough.
But he said, I believe in MRSA. I think he'd had a case in his family. He said, I have no trouble believing in this, but don't go to climate change with me. Okay? It is, I think, accurate that MRSA, other big, slow epidemics like that are sort of slow drip problems. Lots of things contributed to them over decades. And it can feel paralyzing, I think, for any one person to have to confront this and figure out what is my risk and what can I do to help solve it, and what can I do to protect myself. And the reality is, it's not only an individual's problem. Yes, there are things that every single one of us does to potentially to contribute to antibiotic resistance. We take antibiotics when we don't need them, or we take them badly, or we ask them for our kids when our kids don't really need them, because we just need to get our sniffly kid into daycare so we can go to work, and the daycare won't take your child unless your child's on antibiotics. And we vastly overuse and insufficiently track the antibiotics that we use in agriculture, which makes very large-scale agriculture an engine for antibiotic resistance as well. So some of those things can only be diffused by the action of big actors, by municipal action, by government action. An individual person cannot dismantle industrial agriculture. An individual person can't change the culture of healthcare that makes it easier for a physician to give a patient a script, to get them out of the office because he's got another 17 patients waiting behind. But we can refuse to take that script. We can, if we accept that agriculture also fuels antibiotic resistance, we can vote with our currency and buy meat that wasn't raised that way. And we can do simple protective things like, washing our hands and making sure our kids shower after sports, and making sure that we interrogate healthcare personnel when we're in the hospital or we have a loved one in the hospital to make sure that they've washed their hands as well. But the challenging thing is that the big actions have to be taken by someone beyond us.
Sure, absolutely. And just finally coming back to the city theme, I mean, obviously around the world we're seeing the development of mega cities now, where literally, you know, people are crowded in, and at the fringes maybe we're having conditions that could, on paper anyway, be ideal grounds for the development of new diseases or the re-emergence of diseases. So
right.
Is this going to be the next phase that we face?
I think this is terrifying. I mean, the growth of megacities is undeniably one of the, I mean, I think, maybe other people would deny it, but I'm going to assert that the growth of megacities is one of the biggest public health challenges for the coming 100 years and beyond. I have this vivid memory of standing on top of the building that houses the UN's headquarters in New Delhi and looking down onto the largest slum in New Delhi, which is immediately behind that building. Just a greater contrast you could not imagine. The megacities, with the insufficient drinking water, insufficient sanitation, and insufficient surveillance, not even the minimal amount of surveillance that we have in public health systems in more developed cities, bring us back to the Jon Snow era, to something arising and not being tracked before it blows up into a major outbreak. The thing that might help, you know, when I get discouraged about the process of public health, I think of things like the vast growth of using SMS as a public health tracking tool,
sure.
particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Maybe it's possible to empower, you know, the equivalent of the barefoot doctors of the Mao era in China for on-the-ground SMS-based public health surveillance in major shanty towns so that things don't seep along and get out of control before it's too late.
Great. Well, thank you, Maryn. That was very interesting. Sean, does anybody in the audience have any questions for Maryn?
No question.
On the subject of anything? And you've just got a mic coming down to you now. So.
Just I was reading SUPERBUG during the week, and I think it should be given to every healthcare worker as mandatory reading.
Oh, thank you.
But I was just wondering, just from a healthcare perspective, like I know in many hospitals in Ireland there's wards of people with MRSA and things like that. Like, what solutions do you think could prevent that or stop the outbreaks? Because I know originally they reduced the outbreaks and they prevented them, but they seem to be not going away in Ireland anyway.
So what healthcare institutions can do, I think, is a really interesting problem and really disputed. There is a lot of disagreement about this. So if you take the example, for instance, of the Netherlands does what's called search and destroy, or active detection and isolation, on everyone who's coming into healthcare institutions. If you are going in, you are going to get swabbed and checked for the presence of MRSA, which tends to live on our skin, and particularly like sort of the damp spot just inside our nostrils. That's its preferred place of living. If you are found to be colonized carrying it, then you'll be put into isolation until you're cleared from it, which takes a couple of different, it can be washes, or it can be a gel up your nose, or sometimes actually systemic antibiotics. As a result, the Netherlands has an incredibly low rate of MRSA. In the United States, which of course does not have a single-payer healthcare system, unlike the Netherlands, and therefore, you know, has an incredibly patchwork and chaotic system, this active detection and isolation has been implemented only in one major system, which is our Veterans Administration, the healthcare system that guarantees medical care to all members of the armed forces. And they've published good results that it works, that it saves the money and it reduces rates not only of MRSA but of other healthcare-associated infections as well. On the other hand, there are people some of whom work in the VA, whom I know and trust, who say you really have to be careful with this because MRSA doesn't spread in the same manner as some other organisms do. If you focus only on MRSA, are you keeping yourself from also blocking the spread of other organisms, like the highly resistant gram-negatives, for instance? The things that you do to prevent the spread of MRSA aren't necessarily going to prevent the spread of Klebsiella or Acinetobacter. Those particularly the highly resistant gram-negatives, really require less of a focus on hand washing, though everyone should be washing their hands. Hand washing has been a focus of MRSA campaigns because it's a skin-based organism. But the MDROs, the multi-drug resistant organisms, outside of MRSA tend to be more surface problems. They might be not so much on hands long-term as on a bed rail or a curtain or something like that. And that requires really scouring the entire hospital environment. There's just a couple of places in the US that have actually they've started to realize that the health of their patients depends not just on the actions of the people at the top of the healthcare pyramid, the doctors, the surgeons, the nurse managers, and so forth, but on the janitors, because it's the janitors that clean the hospital environment, the building services people, the environmental services people, the people who get the least status, the least respect, the lowest pay, and have the biggest turnover because of all of that. NYU, Tisch Hospital, one of the places that had one of the first CRKP outbreaks, now has this thing called a clean team, where they take their infection control department and they pair each infection preventionist up with a janitor, and they assign each of them to a unit, and they're jointly responsible for the infection rates on the unit. And their infection rates have fallen because now the people who are low status and completely ignored suddenly understand what an important part of the hospital enterprise they are.
Great, thanks. We have another question over here.
Hello. I was just wondering, is there an issue with taking that, like diseases have spread more due to cities, due to density? Is there a parallel with hospitals? Are too many people going into hospitals? Is there a role for sort of like decentralizing healthcare and only dealing with the most extreme cases in hospitals? Would that help alleviate it, or is that oversimplistic?
I think that's a really important question. I mean, I'm sorry I don't know more about your healthcare system, but in the US healthcare systems, there's a huge emphasis now in getting people out of the hospital as soon as possible, in sort of decompressing the hospital population. And partly, of course, that's to save money. Partly it's to deal with the fact that healthcare is in an economic crisis, as is every other major system. But it's also because the longer you're in a hospital, the more you are at risk from the infections that lurk in hospitals. The longer you have a tube in or a catheter in, the longer you're flat in a bed, the more you're at risk. The more you're held down and people come to visit you and touch you and you can't get away. So getting people out of the hospital, which is effectively decompressing it, is actually seen as something that could really help. So yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you.
Anybody else? Oh, Ella.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting, and it's such a pleasure for you to be here. I wanted to ask if you could expand a little bit about the role of agriculture and the use of antibiotics on farms, and an interesting point you made there about it not being tracked.
Right. So this, to me, is it's such a huge topic. Thank you for the question. I'm going to talk about the numbers in the US because those are the ones that I know best. So in the United States, according to relatively recent data from the Food and Drug Administration, which tracks this in one of our cabinet-level agencies, 80% of the antibiotics sold in the United States in any year are used in agriculture, not in humans. 95% of that 80% goes to animals that are not actually sick. No one objects to giving antibiotics to sick animals. To not do that would be a failure of animal welfare. But very large-scale farming, concentrated meat raising, depends for its success on the routine administration of antibiotics to animals in two different ways. There's first a practice that the industry says is passing out of use, which is called growth promotion, or sometimes subtherapeutic use, in which very, very small doses are given to animals because there's a process that's been known since the 1940s but is still not fully understood, in which animals that get those microdoses put on weight faster, which means that you can get them up to market weight faster and sell them faster. So in a purely economic sense, your farmer operation is working much more efficiently. For the amount of feed you're putting in, you're getting more muscle weight out faster. You're making more money. The second use is what I think you could call prophylactic use, which is that keeping animals in confined conditions imposes certain disease risks that would not exist if they were living in the kind of conditions that they evolved to live in, like chickens running around a farmyard or cows open in a pasture. And giving them prophylactic antibiotics prevents any infection spreading in the herds or flocks from developing. So we only know in the US about what antibiotics are being used in agriculture because relatively recently the Food and Drug Administration imposed a user fee for every major sale, and that gives us a rough amount of the literal tonnage of the antibiotic classes being used. But what we don't know is anything specific per farm, per farmer. In many cases, veterinarians aren't involved, though that may be changing. And we don't have any surveillance out the literal back end as to what is showing up on animals, in animals at slaughter, or on the meat that those animals become. Where there is research about whether retail meat is carrying antibiotic-resistant organisms, it's always been undertaken by individual academic researchers. So, you know, to challenge the broad use of antibiotics in agriculture is effectively to challenge most of our agricultural system, which is not something that is likely to be dismantled. But I think it would be reasonable, at least for us, to start asking for more surveillance. So at least we know more accounting on the front end and more surveillance out the back end so that we know what antibiotics are being used and we have a better sense of what organisms are emerging as a result of that use so that we can at least keep track of where they go next.
Right, thank you. Anybody else got more questions? I think we're probably way over time, but we have time for one more.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. You've investigated what happens when these antibiotics, what they actually do, but have you investigated the not taking anything with these antibiotics into it? In other words, the reverse, a preventative. So
are you asking if people use other medical systems, or if they allow, I mean, I don't think it would be a good idea for people not to use antibiotics at all. There are still reasons why antibiotics are a good thing to have.
Yes, but do you think in food, in the food industry that you've just mentioned there, is it a good idea to maybe go the other side and find out where you could actually prevent all these diseases as a result of this interference in relation to profit and things like that?
Well, you know, there are some natural experiments going on. I mean, I'm sorry I don't know more about the Irish system, but in the US there is a growing sector, small, but growing sector of agriculture that is antibiotic-free, that's certified organic. The problem is there's so much different nomenclature and not very much regulation still for what's going on, that actually figuring out what happens as a result is kind of apples and oranges. But certainly within that sector in the US, you know, any antibiotic use and you're not considered organic, for instance. If you have an organic herd and a cow gets sick and you give the animal antibiotics to make it well, you then have to sell it out of the herd. So we can start to see, perhaps, what goes on around where those animals are being raised. There's one really interesting piece of research that was very preliminary. There's a particular strain of MRSA that is known as pig MRSA or livestock MRSA that actually arose in pigs in the Netherlands in 2004 and now has spread through the European Union, into Canada and into the United States. Starts in pigs, moves into pig workers, then moves sort of into the healthcare system. And it's a very distinctive strain because it retains the signature of resistance to tetracycline, which is not used for staph in humans, but is widely used in raising pigs. The group that identified pig MRSA in the United States, in farms in Iowa and Illinois, did a piece of research in which they looked for it in pigs and pig workers, farm workers, on conventional farms and on organic farms. And they found it in a certain percentage of the pigs and the farm workers on the conventional farms, and they found 0 on the lone organic farm that they got to look at. That's very small numbers. It's research that definitely needs to be repeated and scaled up, but I think it's an early signal that there's a distinct effect there that we need to look more closely at.
Great.
Thank you.
I think we could probably talk about this all night, but I'm afraid we probably have to draw it to a close. So could I ask you to show your appreciation to Maryn, please?
Thank you so much.